I'm Neal Hall with the National Pork Board, and thanks for joining me for a Pork 101. And we're going to talk all things pork, both fresh and processed. So if you would just envision a half of a hog laying here on the table, right? So we start, this would be the back end, so the fresh leg, it's where we get ham, it's where we get prosciutto, it's where we get all of that delicious smoked and cured meats. Then we move to the middle, which is where we get our ribs, and we'll talk in more detail about the different kinds of ribs. It's where the belly is at, so that's where we get bacon. It's where we get pork chops. It's where we get some of the value-added items that we'll also talk about. And I'll do some cutting on this as well, just to show you some ideas of where the cuts come from that you'll see in the retail case. And then we move up to the shoulder. So the shoulder is basically the pork butt or shoulder and the picnic, and then all of the delicious goodness that comes from the front end of the pig. So think about sausage, think about charcuterie, think about all of the items from a value-added standpoint that come from the front end of the pig. So we'll spend some time in each one of these sections, but appreciate you joining me, and welcome to Pork 101. So now we're going to talk just a little bit about the back leg of the pig. So think about the back hind quarter of the pig, and that's where ham comes from. And ham has really transitioned. If you think about 35, 40 years ago, it was that traditional holiday meal where you gathered around either Thanksgiving, Christmas, or Easter and had a big boneless ham or a big spiral sliced ham. And the reality is, with consumers shifting, smaller households, younger consumers entering the category, the ham category has changed a lot. So I've just got a few examples of things that you can find at your local grocery store. Most ham is very lean. So if you think about a natural juice ham, which means that it doesn't have water added to it or it cooks back to its green weight, will be 98, 99% fat-free. So instead of large boneless hams, which they used to be run like 14 pounds, now you can buy a small portion. It's pre-sliced, ready to go for that dining occasion. Deli ham is also an option. So you've got trays like this where you can buy it. It's already shaved, ready to go for deli meat sandwiches, another great option. You can also find ham steaks. So you can find a traditional bone-in ham steak, which would have the ham bone in the middle. I think about that when I think about my mom or my grandma, because they like to cook with that simply because of the flavor. This is great on the grill. It's fully cooked, so it doesn't take a lot of time to cook it. You just retherm it up to 140, and then you're good to go. A nice center of the plate item. These are just some other examples of ham items that you will find in the marketplace. These could work for breakfast steaks. These could work for a ham sandwich. Again, fully cooked and ready to go. And then from a convenience standpoint, because that's really one of the things that I want to demonstrate throughout this Pork 101 session, is the versatility of pork, right? We're transitioning away from that heavy center of the plate type entree to more of that pork as an ingredient. Today you can buy diced ham. So this is an example of a brand that I picked up, and perfect for omelets, goes in soups. You can add it to a lot of different dishes, and it's really that idea of pork as an ingredient, which then helps to bring out the flavor. So today we're going to talk a lot about pork's versatility. We're going to talk about a lot about the flavor, and then really it's all about taste what pork can do. So now we're going to transition from the ham, which is the back leg of the pig, into the middle, which is where we get our ribs, it's where we get our bellies, and it's where we get our loin, which is where the pork chops come from. So as you transition off of the ham into the loin, you have the sirloin end of the loin. Sirloin is, you can find it as a roast like this, which is netted. Talked to a local butcher this morning at the meat case. This is an item that's certified heart healthy by the American Heart Association. It's one of those lean cuts that we really like to focus on. Now, if you want to do some boneless sirloin chops, and if you've got a full service meat counter, the butcher can do it, but it's really easy to do. So that's kind of that sirloin end of the loin as it transitions back into the leg. So if you just took a piece like that, and you wanted to make some nice boneless chops that are very lean, then you've got a nice boneless sirloin chop. Again, one of those lean cuts that we really like to focus on from a nutritional standpoint. So that's the sirloin end of the loin, and I'll make another cut here just so you can see how nice and lean this cut is. So again, it can be a roast or you can do it into chops. And you can prepare those chops on the grill, you can prepare them in the air fryer, cook to 145 with a 3-minute rest, and you'll never be disappointed. So that's the sirloin end of the loin. Now we're going to get into the middle and what I like to call is the center cut. So one of the things I want to highlight, a pig has 2 of every part. So it has 2 hams, 2 bellies, 2 sets of ribs, 2 loins, 2 shoulders, and then there's really 3 basic rib cuts. So what I want to talk a little bit first is about the spare rib. So the spare rib comes off of the belly. So if you can see the spare rib, it comes off the belly, and you can buy those at any local retailer, has those all the time. That's one of the popular rib cuts. The other one that you'll traditionally find is a St. Louis style rib. This is very popular on the food service side of the industry simply because it's uniform from end to end. And every pig will have 2 sets of either spare ribs or St. Louis ribs. Now, from a cost factor, if you wanted to save a few dollars and buy a spare rib, you can convert at home to do the same thing, right? The same thing that we're doing in the packing houses. And you can just come in and take off that meaty brisket bone. You just got to find the right spot to cut through the cartilage. And a good sharp knife is always helpful too. So now I just converted the spare rib into the St. Louis style rib. Great on the smoker. What you'll see a lot of retailers doing nowadays, and then this is a meaty brisket. So you could smoke that as well, and then you get rib tips from that. What we're seeing a lot of retailers do today is from a convenience side, they're selling individual ribs. So think about having a tray in the meat department where I can get 6 single bones that are laid out nice on the tray, and then those are perfect for party style ribs. If you smoke these individually, you get some really great bark on them and then some really great flavor. And again, 145 with a minimum with a 3-minute rest. On ribs, you're going to want to take those up to 195 to 200 just so it's fall off the bone tender. So that's the spare rib, and again, we get 2 of those off of every pig. Now, the loin back rib, which is also known as the baby back rib, there was a restaurant chain that made those popular years ago with their classic advertising. We only get loin back or baby back ribs when we bone out the loin. So if we don't bone out the loin, then we end up with bone-in pork chops. So this would be a center cut New York chop or a rib chop because it's got the rib bone on there. So when you grill those to 145 with that 3-minute rest, don't waste any of that deliciousness in there next to the bone. So that would be a bone-in New York style chop or a rib chop. You can also get what we call a porterhouse chop. So the porterhouse has the pork loin and it also has the tenderloin. And we'll talk a little bit about the tenderloin in just a second. But this is a great item to throw on the grill for a nice center of the plate, very lean, and we'll talk a little bit more about tenderloin. And then you get into our boneless chops. So these would be boneless center cut chops cut right from the center of the loin. I'm going to show you where those come from, and then we'll talk a little bit about the tenderloin and some of the marinated fully or value added items, which are pre-marinated, ready to go for that consumer that wants to still feel like they're cooking, but it's taken a step or 2 out of it, and it's really all about convenience. I can take these home, throw them on the grill. So loin back ribs, we transition from that sirloin end into the center cut, and then you get into the rib end of the loin. And you can see right here, this is where this piece came off of, right? So in the plant, they would have boned that out, and you get a nice slab of baby back ribs. The one thing that you'll always notice on these is they tend to taper, right? They taper from being wider in one end, and then they taper down to where those bones are shorter on the other end. A really nice meaty piece of pork to put on the smoker. And again, you could do single bones, you could do a lot of different things with that item, but that's the ribs. So let's talk a little bit about the loin. So this is a full boneless center cut loin, right? And you can buy this in multiple different ways at a retail location. Sometimes you'll see it where it's a half boneless loin, right? And it's cryovac. You'll also see where it'll be a quarter roast, right? So those are items that you can buy that are a little more friendly to that smaller household, or you can buy the whole one. If you come in on one like this, and I just take some nice cuts off of it, then I've got boneless center cut chops. So exactly like the chops that are on the tray, but ones that you could make at home or talk to your customers about. It's a way to save a little bit of money. Let's talk a little bit about the marinated items, because there are basically two things. There's a marinated tenderloin and there's a marinated loin fillet. They look very similar in the case. The one thing is, we'll talk a little bit about the tenderloin. The marinated loin fillet is basically what they're doing in the packing house is they're taking a boneless center cut loin and they're cutting it this way. And then they're marinating that, and that's your boneless loin fillet. Lots of different seasoning varieties, a lot of different companies that are making those, but it's really that convenience item for the consumer at home. But that's where a boneless loin fillet comes from. Now the tenderloin is the leanest muscle on the pig, right? And the one thing that you'll always have to remember is there's this, what we call a membrane or a silver skin on that tenderloin. It's really easy just to peel that off, because you want to peel that off before you cook it. But this item is very lean. It's one of those lean cuts we like to focus on, and it's very versatile. So you can buy it pre-seasoned, pre-marinated, ready to go on the grill, or you can buy, typically there's a 2-pack. You might find them in your stores as a 1-pack, but there's a lot of different things that you can do with a pork tenderloin. You can make beautiful medallions, and talk about lean, doing stir fry. I mean, you can do a lot of things with the tenderloin. You can do a partial cut through, and then you can butterfly it out. If you really wanted to get creative, then you just take a strip of bacon, wrap around it like that, poke a toothpick in it, and you've got a bacon wrapped pork tenderloin. So again, a very lean cut, very versatile item. You can find it at most retailers, and if you got a butcher and you want them to cut medallions, they can cut medallions as well. But a very lean piece of pork, it's very valuable on the pig. So we're going to transition into the rib end of the loin, right? So this is my favorite part, because you get into the rib end, and I'll make a cut here and show you as this starts to transition where you get this dual muscle. So you've got the spinalis as it moves up into the shoulder of the animal. These ribeye chops is what you would find those at your stores. And again, you could cut those out of a boneless loin, one of my favorite cuts, and then you just season, throw it on the grill, cook it to 145 with a 3-minute rest, and you will never be disappointed. It's such a tender piece of meat. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about, and I'm going to talk a little bit about value added, is what you're seeing a lot of retailers and a lot of our packer processors are doing is they're creating value added items. And again, that's items that if you want a diced sirloin for stews, for soups, for chilies, you can find these now at retailers where it's already cut up and ready to go. So there's no work at home. It's just opening the package and throwing it into your recipe. I also found some teriyaki skewers made out of pork loin. I mean, these could made out of different cuts, but this is out of looks like that rib end of the loin. But again, a value-added item, very popular in the air fryer. And one interesting stat is the fastest growing appliance in the United States today is air fryer. There's more air fryers in U.S. households than there are coffee pots. So you're starting to see a lot of items that are coming out that will work well in the air fryer. From a value-added loin standpoint, you can now find stuffed chops. There's a few retailers that focus on that specifically around certain holidays. But again, a traditional item but if you don't want to stuff it at home, you can buy it already pre-done. Now, if you had a customer that wanted to stuff it at home, it's really easy to do. So you take a thick boneless center cut chop, which is like that, and then you would just cut a pocket in that, and then you've got the spot to put your seasonings. So again, if you're creative and you got a client that wants to be creative, they can make stuffed chops themselves, or they can buy them pre-prepared. Let's talk a little bit about belly, because belly is really an item that continues to be popular. Everybody loves bacon, so I'm just going to give you just a little idea here on the belly. So nice center cut. Somebody complains about the bacon's fat. I mean, you want a nice ratio of fat to lean in the belly. Typically it's 60-40. Every pig's different. Every belly is different, just like on a human being. Bacon is the most popular item, but you're seeing this. There's a big craze with pork belly burn ends. So if you've got a client that really wants to indulge on flavor, all you have to do is take a pork belly and then cut it into cubes. And then you season that up, throw it on the smoker. It's like meat candy. So that's another option for the pork belly. We talked a little bit about ribs, right? And there being 3 kinds of ribs: St. Louis, spare ribs, and loin back. There are also country style ribs. So a country style rib, this is a bone-in country style rib that's made from the rib end of the loin. So they're basically taking a bone-in loin, cutting chops, and then cutting those chops in half. And again, a great item to put on the smoker. You've got some rib meat on there, but a really, really convenient item. And then what you're also seeing a lot of retailers doing now is value adding. So pre-seasoned, ready to go, ready to throw in the air fryer, ready to throw on the smoker. These are boneless, and again, from that rib end of the loin. So lots of convenient items that really drive flavor. I talked a little bit about bacon. This is just a couple examples. This is what we call a stack pack. So it's just a slab style. And this is what we call a J-board. So that's where the packer would have it laid out. That's a lot and a little bit on the center of the pig, but it's where there's tons of flavor when you think about ribs, when you think about bellies, when you think about bacon. But it's a great vehicle for flavor. So up to this point, we've talked about the back end of the hog, or the ham, the fresh leg that processes into smoked and cured meats. We talked about the middle, which is where we get everybody's favorite bacon. We get pork chops, we get all of the ribs, we get the loin. So we've transitioned through those. Now we're going to talk about the front shoulder, or the front leg of the pig. One thing that I really wanted to highlight as we're in this section is to talk about packaging, because what you can see is there are a few different varieties of packaging here on the counter, and I'll talk a little bit about each of those. We did consumer research, and the consumer thinks that a foam tray that's overwrapped with plastic is fresh because the butcher did it in the back of the house, in the meat department. The reality is every one of these items is a case-ready item, with the exception of the pork burger. So and a case-ready item is one that comes delivered to the store, already packed. It's made at a packing plant and ready to merchandise in store. So packaging's come a long ways, but this would be a foam tray. These would be overwrapped. We've removed all the branding for this section. This packaging here, and you saw some of the pork chops in a package like this as well. It's called a modified atmosphere package. So it's a modified atmosphere. There's a film across the top, and again, it comes in case ready into the store, ready for them to merchandise. So this is an example of that as well. This is a cryovac package, which is a little bit different, but it's basically in the plant where there's a pocket that's formed, the meat goes in the pocket, and then there's a film laid over the top, and then it seals. You get really good shelf life out of that. So all examples of different packaging. We'll talk a little bit about the shoulder. So this is the Boston butt, and the Boston butt, just if anybody was curious where that name came from. So you think about colonial days on the East Coast, they would store, the way they preserved the meat was they would put the pork in wooden barrels that were called butts. And then they would pack them with salt, and that's how they preserved it. And that's where the term Boston butt came from. You'll also see this labeled as pork shoulder. So it's one of those things where there's some different naming for it. The whole front shoulder would be a big item in the East Coast, in the Carolinas, for barbecue, because they will take and smoke this whole piece and then shred it for pulled pork. Everything up on this front end of the hog, it's all about low and slow, right? There's a lot of great flavor. There's a lot of good color and marbling in these muscles, but there's also a lot of connective tissue. So that low and slow will help you break down that connective tissue. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the picnic, but this is a whole picnic. Skin on. In multicultural cohorts, they like this skin on because then you get chicharrones, which is basically pork rinds. So this you can find at most stores. You can also buy this as a half piece. You can also buy a boneless picnic roast. And again, this is a very, very lean piece of meat and designed to be low and slow. So it could be done in the crock pot, could be done on the smoker, but really designed to be low and slow. Cook it to 195, 200 degrees, and then you just pull it for shredded pork. On the Boston butt, I'm going to set this off to the side. So on the Boston butt, this is where we get pork steaks. So a bone-in pork steak would be this item right here. So traditional, big, popular item in St. Louis, but it's also popular around the country. Great on the grill, but you'll notice that it's got the blade bone in. So basically what we're doing is we're taking the butt and we're slicing pork steaks out of that butt. So that's one option from the pork shoulder, is you can get some really nice pork steaks. Another option from the butt, and we talked about ribs earlier, right? And a quick reminder, we've got St. Louis, we've got loin back, and we've got spares. We talked about loin country style ribs. There's also country style ribs that are made out of the pork shoulder. So another option where full of flavor, again, low and slow, but marinated on the grill, in the oven, in the air fryer, just a great item that brings lots of flavor to the table. You will also find at retail, you can find a netted, boneless shoulder roast, right? So some people will ask, well, why is the netting on there? Sometimes the netting's on there because there's multiple pieces, and sometimes the netting's on there just for that visual look, because consumers like to see that netting. So you'll notice when I take the netting off, there's just one piece where that had a knife cut where the bone came out of there. So really you could take that netting off, again, low and slow, put it on the smoker. One thing that if you wanted to do with this piece is you could make some beautiful boneless pork steaks. So again, an item that maybe isn't widely known, but in the barbecue circuit, this would be called the money muscle or the Copa muscle. You're starting to see some retailers differentiate. This is a Copa style steak. Again, not cut in store. This was cut in one of the packing plants, came into the stores as case ready, but an incredible value, right? Full of flavor, but an incredible value when compared to some of the other cuts in the meat case. Now what I want to show you is a quick trick on the whole shoulder. So again, this is the Boston butt. So if you think about this on the animal, and we talked about the boneless loin earlier, that boneless loin would have come right in through here. And we talked about that rib end of the loin where you've got the dual muscle, which is really tender, a lot of good pH in there. It makes a great eating experience. That transitions into this end. So one thing that you can do was when you buy a whole pork shoulder, you can come in and make a cut just like that. I'm going to show you what that magic that turns in. This is the money muscle. So if you're a barbecue competition guy, you're smoking this whole shoulder, but when you take your barbecue, put it in your box and take to the judges, you're shredding from the money muscle, because that's what wins barbecue competitions. So you take that piece off, This can be done on the smoker for pulled pork. You could dice it for green chili pork stew. You could slice it thin for al pastor. Very authentic items come out of the pork shoulder. And I wanted to show just a couple items. These are two examples of al pastor that I found at local retailers. So we're getting into some of those value added, again, those items that consumers really want to crave that taste and flavor. They don't have time to do the marinating. This comes in fully done. All you've got to do is put it in a skillet and cook it up, add some pineapple, some lime and cilantro, and you've got an authentic Hispanic flavored dish. So lots that you can do with the pork shoulder. Now there is a bone in this, so when you smoke, you know that that's done when that bone just falls right out, right? So we can talk at another time about some of the smoking techniques, but that's one of the things. So now this muscle that came off of the money muscle, right? And it came off that loin. Some absolutely gorgeous cuts of boneless pork steak. Now, the same cuts as this, but from a cost standpoint, $5 and something a pound versus $2 something a pound on that. So again, one of those items where some of your clients could stretch their dollars, but really an indulgent piece of meat. I will tell you, seasoned, grilled to 145 with a 3-minute rest, and it eats as well as any cut of meat you've ever done on the grill. So again, just a beautiful piece of item off of the shoulder that comes off the loin. So now let's talk a little bit about ground pork, because what we've seen is ground pork continues to be popular. We've seen more and more varieties of ground pork. Talked about packaging, so we've got the overwrapped styrofoam tray. We've got the modified atmosphere package. We've got what we call a brick pack. So brick pack sometimes is more regional, but it also is more conducive to the packer that's making the item. Works really well in the freezer, stacks well in the fridge. And then you've got a chub. So here in the Midwest, chubs are very popular with other ground proteins, so you'll find ground pork in a chub as well. Now, we've seen some seasoned items. So this is a taco seasoned ground pork. So again, an item that's ready for taco night. Again, convenience for the consumer, no extra work. And then you get into some of the smoked sausages. So again, out of the shoulder, you've got breakfast sausage patties, you've got brats for the grill, you've got lots of value added items. These are two kielbasa's, one's fully cooked, right? So a rope, all you have to do is heat it up to temp. It's great in pastas, buy a slice, or there's now one available that's a raw, what I call a raw rope. So that one could go on the smoker, and again, great for recipes. Meatballs are very popular. You'll find these at the majority of retailers. If you look, most of them are all ground pork. One thing that I have seen, I couldn't find it today, you're also starting to see some items that are ground beef and pork blend, simply because the cost of beef, some packers are blending pork into that to bring the cost down. It also drives a lot of flavor for that consumer. Another thing that comes from the front end or the shoulder is charcuterie. So this is just an example of some dry sausage items. The prosciutto comes from the ham, but lots of flavor that's driven from charcuterie. And that's really popular with younger consumers as we think about moving the needle away from our traditional consumer to that younger consumer that's really looking at pork as an ingredient. So we talked about ground pork and the packaging types with the foam tray, with the modified atmosphere package, with the brick pack, and with the chub. I did want to talk a little bit about fat to lean ratios, because we did a lot of research a few years ago and did a market landscape on ground pork and found out that consumers want to know what the fat to lean ratio is. And we've seen a transition where on pack you will find the fat to lean call out, similar to what there is on beef, because consumers are familiar with that. So you're starting to see an 80-20, an 85-15, a 90-10. There is a 93-7 also available at a few retailers on the East Coast. But it's a consumer buys ground meat based on the fat to lean ratio. And I'll just give a quick example. We had a retailer that had an 80-20. They added a 90-10 and found out that it drew a new consumer to the category. And with the affordability, the value that pork brings to the marketplace right now, ground pork continues to grow in popularity. We're seeing expansion of that set. So I just wanted to call that out, right? Just not only from a packaging difference, but from the fat to lean ratio that's on ground pork. So really to put a bow on everything, so we talked about basically head to toe on the pig. So as a quick recap, the fresh leg on the back end is the ham. In the middle we had the loin, the belly, the ribs, and then we talked here about the shoulder, which is all about low and slow. It's all about flavor. It's all about those value-added items that are convenient for the consumer. I did want to highlight the lean cuts that we've talked about today. So the first one was that sirloin chop, right? Certified heart healthy by the American Heart Association. You can find this as a sirloin roast, or you can find it as sirloin chops. And if you don't find it in the meat case, ask the butcher. They can certainly get it for you. So that's one of the lean cuts. We also talked about the pork tenderloin, another item that's certified heart healthy by the American Heart Association, and really that lean muscle that's so versatile. You can season it and grill it. You can slice it thin for salads. You can do a lot of things with that pork tenderloin. Then we talked briefly about that porterhouse chop, right? It's got the pork tenderloin on it, but think about it from a T-bone standpoint. It's similar, right? You got the loin eye and you've got the tenderloin. That's one of the lean cuts that we've talked about. And then we get into the boneless loin. You've got the New York chop, which is basically a boneless center cut chop. If this wasn't cut into chops, you would have a New York roast. So available at all retailers. And then finally we have the ribeye chop, which again has got that dual muscle. This is where there's lots of flavor. There's lots of intermuscular marbling that's going to really derive that flavor home. So appreciate you joining for Pork 101. Would encourage you to join our Pork and Partners group. You can go to pork.org/Pork and Partners to sign up, and look forward to seeing you at more educational opportunities in the future.